She walked 12 miles through canyon wind with nothing but a dead man's letter, and the kind of desperation that makes people do things they'll spend years trying to explain. He hadn't spoken to another human being in 6 weeks, and the moment she handed him that letter, Gideon Vale read 3 sentences, folded it back up, and said the last thing Elena Whitlock ever expected to hear from a man like him. "I'll marry you." Not out of love, not out of pity, out of a promise made to a man already in the ground. And whatever that says about Gideon Vale, it says everything. Stay until the end, hit like, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The canyon didn't care about your problems. That was the first thing most people learned when they came to this stretch of Wyoming. The high walls of red and ochre stone, the wind that cut sideways through the draws, the silence so complete it had texture. The land out here didn't offer sympathy. It offered itself, raw and indifferent, and you either learned to live inside that indifference, or you broke against it like everything else that had tried and failed to make a permanent mark on this part of the world. Gideon Vale had learned. 37 years of learning, most of it hard. He was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard the sound. Not a horse, which would have been normal, not a wagon, which would have been expected. Just boots on gravel, slow and uneven, the footsteps of someone who had been walking longer than they should have been. He set the axe against the chopping block and stood up straight, hand going instinctively to the side of his hip before he caught himself. Old habit, not always a useful one. She came around the bend in the trail at the edge of his property where the juniper thicket thinned out, and she was not what he expected. He hadn't been expecting anyone at all, which was more or less his natural state. But if he'd been forced to guess, he wouldn't have guessed this. A woman, somewhere in her late 20s, wearing a brown wool coat that had seen better years, carrying a satchel over one shoulder that hung heavy enough to pull her slightly sideways. Her dark hair was tied back but coming loose at the temples. Her boots were caked in pale canyon dust all the way to the ankle. She stopped when she saw him. He didn't move. There was a moment, maybe 3 seconds, maybe 5, where they just looked at each other across 40 feet of frost-hardened yard, 2 strangers trying to make quick calculations about the other, neither one particularly comfortable with what they were seeing. "Gideon Vale?" she called out. Her voice was steadier than she looked. "That's my name," he said. She reached into the satchel while she walked closer, and he watched her hand carefully until she pulled out an envelope, white, already opened, slightly bent at one corner. She held it out toward him when she got within arm's reach, and he saw that her hand was trembling. Not from fear, from cold and exhaustion. He took the envelope. "My name is Elena Whitlock," she said. "My father was Thomas Whitlock. He passed away 19 days ago. That letter—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "He asked me to bring it to you personally. He said you'd understand why when you read it." Gideon looked down at the envelope. The handwriting on the front said only, "Gideon, read this alone." He recognized the script, angular, left-leaning, stubborn-looking. Thomas Whitlock's hand. He hadn't seen it in almost 4 years. He looked back up at the woman. "Thomas is dead," he said. It wasn't a question, but it sounded like he was testing the fact, pressing on it to see if it held weight. "Yes." He looked at her for another moment, then turned toward the cabin door. "Come inside," he said. "It's too cold to stand in the yard." The inside of the cabin was sparse, in the way that happens when a person has lived alone long enough that comfort stops being a consideration. A single table, 2 chairs that didn't match, a wood stove in the corner that was doing serious work against the November chill, a shelf of tools along one wall, a narrow bunk against the other. No curtains, a window with frost on the lower pane, a rifle above the door, which Elena noted without making it obvious that she'd noted it. Gideon set a tin cup of water in front of her without asking if she wanted it, then pulled the second chair around so he could sit facing her instead of across the table. He unfolded the letter and read it. She watched his face while he did. She'd spent 19 days wondering what was in that letter. Her father had written it in the last week of his life, in private, and sealed it himself. He'd pressed it into her hands 3 days before he died, and made her promise to deliver it in person. "Don't send it. Don't give it to anyone else. You go yourself, Elena." You put it in his hand. She'd asked why. He'd looked at her the way he sometimes did, like he was weighing how much truth was appropriate, and he'd said, "Because some debts you can only pay one way, and I want him to see your face when he reads it." She still didn't entirely know what that meant. Gideon's face, as he read, gave away almost nothing. A slight tightening around the eyes at one point, a long pause halfway through. His jaw moved once, like he was grinding a thought down to size. Then he folded the letter back along its original creases and set it on the table between them. He was quiet for long enough that Elena stopped waiting for him to speak first. "What did he tell you?" she asked. "About why he sent you here?" "He said you were in trouble and there was nobody left who could help me." She corrected herself immediately, the exhaustion making her fumble the words. "Help me, I mean. Nobody left who could help me." Gideon noticed the slip. He didn't comment on it. "What kind of trouble?" She put both hands around the tin cup, absorbing the warmth. "My father had debts. I didn't know the full extent of them until after he passed. There's a loan against the house we were living in, not our property. It was rented, but the loan was secured against his business equipment and some other holdings I didn't know existed." She exhaled slowly. "The man he borrowed from, his name is Harlan Grist. He has a lawyer. I don't. The lawyer sent a letter saying I have 30 days to settle or vacate the premises and surrender all associated assets." She paused. "That was 11 days ago. So you have 19 days. I have 19 days and no money and no standing because my father didn't put my name on anything." Her voice was flat when she said it, not bitter. More like she'd already burned through bitter and come out the other side into something harder. A woman with no property, no husband, no documented claim. In this territory, Mr. Vale, that means I have nothing. Gideon leaned back in his chair. It creaked under him. He looked at the letter on the table without picking it back up. "Your father and I knew each other a long time ago," he said finally. "We were in a bad situation together, the kind you don't come out of unless someone makes a choice that costs them something. He made that choice." He stopped. "I told him I owed him. He said he'd never collect on it." Another pause. "He collected." Elena hadn't known that. Her father had never mentioned Gideon Vale by name, or if he had, not in a way she'd retained. It landed strangely, this information. 19 days ago, her father had been alive, and whatever this was between him and this man in front of her, it had been an unresolved thing sitting in the background of her father's life for years, apparently. Waiting. "What does the letter say?" she asked. Specifically. Gideon looked at her for a moment, assessing something. Then he said, "He asked me to look after you." "Look after me," she repeated. The words had an odd shape in her mouth. "He knew I'd come here." "He asked you to come here." "He made me promise." She set the cup down. "I kept the promise. I walked here from Dunette's Crossing because the stage doesn't run to this part of the canyon. 12 miles. She looked at him directly. "Mr. Vale, I appreciate whatever you and my father meant to each other, and I'm grateful you let me in out of the cold. But I'm not here to ask for charity. I don't know what looking after me means to you or what my father thought you could do, but I'm going to offer you a practical arrangement," Gideon said. She stopped. He said it the same way he'd said everything else, plainly, without inflection, like he was stating a repair that needed doing on a piece of fence. "You need legal standing. You need a name that carries documented property rights in this territory. I have both of those things." He paused. "I'm not a man who does things by half measures, and I'm not going to stand here and propose some arrangement that doesn't actually solve your problem. What I'm proposing is a legal marriage, not a performance of one, an actual one, with documents filed in Harlan County." Elena stared at him. Outside, the wind picked up through the juniper. Something scraped against the cabin roof. A branch, probably, or a piece of loose shingle. "You're serious," she said. "I don't say things I'm not serious about." "You don't know me." "No." "We met." She checked without meaning to, glancing toward the window as if the light outside could confirm it. 12 minutes ago. "Approximately," he agreed. "And you're proposing marriage." "I'm proposing a legal solution to your legal problem," he said. "Call it what you need to call it. It would be a marriage in the eyes of the law and anyone who needed to see paperwork. What it is between us is a separate matter, and one we could discuss with considerably more time than you currently have." She pressed the heels of her hands against the edge of the table and pushed herself back slightly, not standing, just creating a few inches of space, the way a person does when they need to think. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read, part suspicion, part something else. Something that might have been the very early edge of relief and was working hard to disguise itself as skepticism. "Why?" she said. "Would you do this?" Gideon picked up the letter. "Because Thomas Whitlock once walked into a situation that wasn't his problem, so that I could walk out of it. That's why." He set it back down. "That's all." The fire in the wood stove snapped. Elena looked at it for a long moment, then looked back at him. She had spent 19 days moving toward this cabin, across a landscape that offered nothing in the way of comfort or reassurance, carrying a letter she couldn't read, trying to honor a promise made to a dying man who had apparently known something about Gideon Vale that she hadn't. She was tired. She was cold. She had $11 in the bottom of her satchel and a lawyer's letter waiting back in a rented house that was going to stop being hers in 19 days. She said, "What would you expect from me?" "Work," he said. "This ranch is barely holding. I'm better with cattle and land than I am with accounts and organizing. I've lost 3 seasons of record keeping. The property has problems I haven't had time to address because I've been doing it alone." He looked at her directly. "I'd expect a partner in the practical sense, not a housekeeper, not a guest, a person who works for a stake in something real. And in terms of your own space," he said before she could finish, "your own life. This would be legal protection, not a claim on your person." She absorbed that. Then she said, "My father trusted you." "Apparently. He wasn't a man who trusted easily." "No, he wasn't." Another silence. Elena looked down at her hands on the table, the dust still under her fingernails from the trail, a small cut on her left knuckle she'd gotten on a fence wire 2 days ago and forgotten about. She thought about Thomas Whitlock in the last weeks of his life, sick and thin, and still managing somehow to work out contingencies. Still managing to know things she didn't. "All right," she said. "Yes." Gideon nodded once, like a decision had been made about where to route the water channel. "We'll need to go into Caldwell for the filing. Can you ride?" "Yes. There's a horse in the back pasture that won't give you trouble. We'll go in 3 days when the weather holds." He stood up, moved to the wood stove to add another piece of split oak. "There's a room off the back of the cabin. Nothing fancy, but there's a good latch on the door and a proper window." He didn't look at her when he said it. "You can stay there tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out what needs doing." Elena looked at the ceiling, low, dark beamed, with a small spider web in one corner she doubted he'd ever noticed. She thought about the letter, about 12 miles of canyon trail, about a man she'd never met who had apparently been carrying a debt to her father for years without her knowing. She picked up her satchel. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," said Gideon Vale. "You haven't seen the books." The room off the back was small and cold, but had what he'd promised: a solid latch, a window that faced east, a rope-strung cot with 2 wool blankets stacked on it. There was a wooden peg on the wall and a small shelf someone had built with uneven boards, but genuine care. Elena hung her coat on the peg and sat on the edge of the cot for a long time without lying down. She could hear him moving around in the main room. The wood stove door opened and closed. Boots on the plank floor. Then quiet. She reached into the bottom of her satchel and found the photograph. Small, oval-framed, slightly water-damaged on one corner. Her father, at maybe 50 years old, standing in front of the equipment barn at the old place, squinting slightly into the sun the way he always did in photographs because he refused to wear his hat for them. She looked at it for a while. "You knew what you were doing, didn't you?" she thought at him. "You always knew exactly what you were doing." She set the photograph on the small shelf above the cot where she could see it, lay back on top of the blankets with her coat pulled over her for extra warmth, and let exhaustion do what it had been trying to do for 12 miles. Morning came with the sound of an axe. Elena woke before full light, which was a habit built over years of life on a working property, the kind of schedule your body adopts whether you choose it or not. She lay still for a moment in the unfamiliar room, orienting herself. The smell of wood smoke, the cold air against her face, while the rest of her was warm under the coat and wool, the rhythmic sound from outside. She got up, dressed, opened the door to the main room. He'd already had a fire going for some time. The cabin was considerably warmer than the back room, and there was a pot on the wood stove that smelled like coffee. 2 cups on the table. He wasn't inside, but he'd clearly thought to put them out. She poured coffee and took it to the window. Outside, Gideon was splitting wood. He was working without a coat despite the temperature, methodical and efficient, each strike landing exactly where it needed to. There was a growing stack beside him that was already substantial. He'd probably been at it since before the light came up. The property looked different in the morning than it had in yesterday's late afternoon exhaustion. Larger and harder. The main cabin was solid but needed work. She could see where the chinking between the logs had begun to fail along the north wall, where the roof line sagged slightly at one corner, where a section of fence along the near paddock had been jury-rigged with wire instead of properly repaired. The barn was bigger than she'd expected, and the hay storage structure behind it looked like it had taken some weather damage along the east side. A working ranch trying to function without enough hands. She'd seen that before. The particular kind of slow deterioration that happened not from neglect exactly, but from the arithmetic of one person trying to do the work of 3. She pushed open the cabin door. "Good morning," she called across the yard. He stopped mid-swing, looked over at her. "Morning. Do you want to show me the books today, before the other things?" He set the axe in the block and picked up his coat from the fence post where he'd draped it. "After breakfast," he said, coming across the yard. "I've got sourdough started." She raised an eyebrow. He saw it and something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, more like the recognition that she'd expected something else. "I've been alone a long time," he said. "A man either learns to cook or he gets thin." "Fair enough," she said. They ate at the table. Sourdough bread that he'd made, and eggs from the 3 hens that apparently had the run of a small coop at the side of the property, and more coffee. It was simple and it was good, and they ate mostly without talking, which Elena found she didn't mind. Silence with a purpose in it was different from silence born of discomfort. This felt like the former. After, he brought out the ledger books from a crate under the shelf. 3 of them, well worn, and a 4th that was barely used. He set them on the table and opened the oldest one. "I can tell you roughly what we owe and what we make," he said, "but the details past that are not organized." Elena pulled the first ledger toward her. She was quiet for about 10 minutes while she went through it, turning pages, occasionally tracing a line with her finger, occasionally going back to a previous page to compare figures. Gideon sat across from her and drank his coffee and watched her face in the way that people watch when they're trying to understand what they're seeing. "You know accounting," he said. "My father ran a small supply business for 8 years. I kept the books for the last 4 of them." She turned another page. "This isn't as bad as it looks at first glance. Some of it is bad, but you've been making some assumptions about your timber contract that are costing you, and if you renegotiate that line—" She stopped, looked up. "Sorry. Let me actually finish reading before I start telling you what to do." "No," he said slowly. "Keep going." She looked at him. "Tell me what you see," he said. "I'd rather know sooner." She studied him for a second, then turned back to the book. "The timber contract is set up to favor the buyer. You're delivering on their schedule, not yours, which means you're taking the risk on weather delays, but they're not compensating you for it. You also have a clause in here that allows them to reduce the per-unit rate if delivery falls more than 2 weeks behind, but there's nothing that penalizes them for taking late delivery. That's not a contract, that's a favor." Gideon was quiet. "The cattle accounts are better managed," she continued. "Whoever set up the breeding rotation knew what they were doing. But you're underselling on the spring market because you're going to a single buyer instead of—" She stopped again. "I'm sorry, I'm doing it again." "You're doing fine," he said, and his voice had changed very slightly. Not softer exactly, but with less of the careful flatness he'd been using since she arrived. Like something had relaxed a degree. "I can fix these," she said. "The accounts. Not overnight, and not without some work on the contract side, but I can make a real difference here in the space of a few months, if you'll let me." "That's why you're here," he said simply. "I know." She closed the ledger and set her hands flat on the cover. "I just want to be clear that I intend to earn what you're offering me, Mr. Vale. I'm not here to be a burden to you. I'm here to work." He looked at her across the table. Morning light was coming through the east window now, falling across the ledger books and the coffee cups and the small space between them. "Gideon," he said. She looked at him. "Call me Gideon," he said. "If we're going to be married, calling me Mr. Vale is going to confuse people. She almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a joke she'd heard from him, and it landed quietly, without fanfare. She pressed her lips together. "Gideon," she said, trying it. He nodded, picked up his cup. "I'll show you the water system after this," he said. "That's the next worst problem." What? The following days were a study in adjustment. Not the dramatic kind of adjustment that people tell stories about. Not arguments or standoffs or moments of crisis that clarified everything. Just the quieter, harder kind that comes from two strangers learning to move around each other in the same physical space without collision. Learning which silences meant what. Learning that some habits needed to be modified and others could be left alone. Elena found the water system exactly as bad as Gideon had implied. The primary channel from the creek ran through a wooden trough that had cracked in 3 places and been repaired only with packed clay, which held for part of the year but failed predictably in the freeze cycles. She spent a full day walking the line from the creek to the main storage tank, making notes, calculating what materials would be needed, how much labor, what could be done before winter locked the ground solid. She also found, in her walk of the property's boundary, a fence line along the southeast corner that had been cut. Not fallen, cut. Clean diagonal slices on 4 consecutive posts. She stood in front of it for a while, looking at the cuts, then looked at the ground around it. Hoof prints, more than one horse, but the frost had blurred them past any useful detail. She mentioned it to Gideon that evening. He went still when she described it. Not startled, more like something confirmed. "This has happened before," she said. It wasn't quite a question. He was quiet for a moment. "Twice in the last year," he said. "I put it down to passers-by the first time. The second time I walked the line and found 3 more cuts, different section." Elena looked at him. Someone is making a point, or testing to see what response they get. "What response have they gotten?" "I repaired the fence," he said. "Both times." She nodded slowly, and they read that as no response at all. He didn't say anything, which was itself a kind of answer. "Do you know who it is?" she asked. He was quiet again for long enough that she understood he had a theory and wasn't sure how much to share. Then he said, "There's a woman named Vivian Crow. She runs the largest cattle operation in this county. She's made 2 offers on this land in the past 3 years, through representatives. Both times I declined. And the fence cutting started after the second refusal." He set down the tin cup he'd been holding. "I can't prove it. But you know." He looked at her. "I know." Elena thought about that. She turned it over carefully, the way you turn over a situation that has more angles to it than are immediately visible. "Tell me about the land," she said. "What makes it worth that much pressure?" Gideon looked at the window for a moment, then back at her. "Come outside," he said. "It's easier to show than explain." He took her up the slope behind the cabin in the last hour of afternoon light, through the juniper and up to a rocky outcrop that looked west across the canyon. She climbed beside him in silence, and at the top he stopped and let her look. It was expansive. That was the only word that came close. The canyon opened below them into a broad, flat-floored valley where 2 creek channels came together, and beyond that the land opened further into a stretch of grass and winter-brown meadow that seemed to go on longer than it had any right to. "The confluence," he said, standing beside her. 2 water sources. In this territory, water is everything. You control the water, you control who can graze where, who can run cattle during drought years, who gets priority when the summer dries up the smaller streams. He pointed south. "Vivian Crow's eastern pastures border my land at that ridge. Her cattle don't have independent water access on that side. She's been routing them 2 miles further north to reach another creek. That works until it doesn't, and in a bad drought year, it doesn't. She wants the water rights. She wants everything, the water, the pasture, the canyon access, the timber, but the water most of all." He paused. "If she had it, she could double her herd on the eastern side and cut off 3 other ranches from negotiating independently. She'd have a monopoly on water access for the better part of 40 miles. Elena looked at the confluence below them. The 2 streams caught the fading afternoon light and threw it back silver and slow. "And she can't get it legally," she said. "My claim is clean and documented, has been for 11 years. So she's trying to make it too expensive to hold." "Yes." Elena turned to look at him. The wind up here was sharper, and it moved his hair across his forehead. He was looking at the valley with an expression she was starting to recognize. Something behind his eyes that wasn't exactly worry and wasn't exactly anger, something that lived in between those two things and had been living there for a while. "We're going to need to be smart about this," she said. He looked at her. "We." She held his gaze. "You said a partner. That's what I am." Something moved in his expression. Something that took a while to identify. It wasn't surprise exactly, more like the particular quality of a person who has been alone long enough that the word lands with a weight they weren't entirely prepared for. "Yes," he said. "We." They stood there a moment longer, the two of them on the outcrop above the canyon as the light went thin and golden, and the temperature dropped another degree. Below them, the valley was quiet and enormous and waiting. Then Elena said, "What are the names of the other ranchers she's pressuring?" "Probably 4 or 5, he said. "I know some of them." "Can you get me in a room with them?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Probably." "Good," she said, and started back down the slope. "We're going to need witnesses if this gets to the point of legal claims. We should know who's on which side before we need them." Gideon stood on the outcrop for another second, watching her pick her way carefully down the rocky slope in the failing light, practical and focused, and already thinking ahead to things he hadn't gotten to yet. He picked up her satchel where she'd set it down, because she'd need both hands for the descent, and followed her. 3 days later, they rode into Caldwell. It was a town that had grown faster than its infrastructure, which was true of most towns in this territory. Wide dirt streets that were either dust or mud depending on the season, a general store with a porch that needed replacing, a land office wedged between a feed merchant and a small hotel. There was a saloon that doubled as the nearest thing to a social hall, and a justice of the peace who operated out of a room above the post office 2 days a week. They went to the justice of the peace first. The man's name was Emmett Hale, and he was approximately 60 years old and moved at a pace that suggested he'd made peace with urgency a long time ago. He looked at Gideon, then at Elena, then back at Gideon with an expression that was carefully, professionally neutral. "You're sure about this?" Emmett said, which was not quite a question. "We wouldn't be here if we weren't," Gideon said. Emmett Hale looked at Elena. "Ma'am, of your own free will and with full understanding of what you're signing?" Elena met his eyes. "Yes, sir." The justice looked at them both for another moment, then shrugged slightly and reached for the paperwork. The ceremony itself took about 4 minutes. There were 2 witnesses, a woman who worked in the post office downstairs, who was pulled up because she happened to be there, and a man who was in the process of having a parcel weighed, who seemed mildly bewildered to find himself signing a marriage document. There were no rings. There were no flowers. Elena wore the same wool coat she'd arrived in. Gideon had put on a clean shirt. Emmett Hale said the words. They said the words back. He stamped the paper with a heaviness that suggested this was the most concrete part of the whole proceeding. And it was. Emmett handed Gideon the document and shook his hand. Then he looked at Elena and said, "Well, good luck to you, Mrs. Vale." Mrs. Vale. The name landed on Elena with a small physical weight she hadn't anticipated. She thanked Emmett Hale and turned toward the door, and Gideon held it open for her, and they walked back out into the cold Caldwell street and stood for a moment beside the horses. The wind came through between the buildings. "That's done," Gideon said. "That's done," Elena agreed. They stood there in the thin November sun, 2 people legally bound by a document that was 4 minutes old, and the strangeness of it sat between them with perfect clarity. Neither of them tried to diminish it or rush past it. Elena looked down the street toward the general store, calculating the supply list she'd been building in her head since she walked the property 3 days ago. Gideon looked at the same street and seemed to be thinking something entirely his own. Then he said, "There's a supply merchant 2 doors down. We need a list of materials." "I already have the list," she said, and pulled it from her coat pocket. He looked at it. His mouth moved very slightly, the ghost of something that wasn't quite a smile. "Let's go," he said. They walked down the street together, 2 strangers with a piece of paper and a canyon property, and a problem neither of them had fully measured yet, and the town of Caldwell went about its business around them entirely unaware that anything of particular consequence had just occurred. But it had. It had. and the land waiting for them back at the confluence of two streams knew it, even if neither of them did yet. The supplies took most of the afternoon to load. Elena had written the list in 2 columns, immediate needs on the left, deferred repairs on the right, and she'd organized it by where each item would be sourced in Caldwell, which saved them backtracking between the feed merchant and the general store. Gideon noticed this without commenting on it. He simply followed the order she'd set and paid where she indicated and let her negotiate the price on the iron pipe fittings for the water channel, which she brought down by $1.40 without appearing to try hard. On the ride back, the horses moved slower under the added weight of the loaded packs, and the late afternoon light came in low and gold across the canyon walls. They rode mostly in silence, which had become, in 3 days, their default mode. Not uncomfortable silence, just the kind that happens between people who are each thinking about the same large set of problems from slightly different angles. It was Elena who spoke first. The merchant said the timber buyer comes through in 6 weeks. About right, Gideon said. First week of January, usually. We need to renegotiate before he arrives. If we wait until he's standing in front of us, we lose leverage. She adjusted her grip on the reins. I want to write a letter to his company office first. Formal, with the revised terms laid out clearly. Let him read it before he makes the trip so he knows what conversation he's walking into. Gideon glanced at her. You think he'll walk away? I think he won't want to, she said. Your timber is good quality and he knows it. He'll push back on the weather clause, but if we hold the late delivery penalty, he'll fold on the per unit rate. She paused. He's been getting a good deal for a long time. People like that always act like a fair deal is a robbery. You've dealt with buyers like him before. My father dealt with buyers like him. I watched. She looked ahead at the trail. And I took notes. Gideon said nothing for a moment. Then, you took notes. Old habit, she said simply. He let that sit. They came through the lower canyon just as the temperature started its evening drop. The kind of cold that came in quickly out here once the sun left the walls. Gideon put the horses up while Elena brought the supplies inside in 2 trips, stacking them according to her own logic. Repair materials near the door, food stores toward the back shelf, tools hung or set where they'd actually be reached for. By the time he came in from the barn, the cabin was noticeably more organized than it had been that morning, without looking like anything dramatic had been done to it. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the room. I moved some things, she said, from the stove where she was starting water for the evening meal. Tell me if anything's in the wrong place. He looked around again. The tools were where he would have put them if he'd ever gotten around to it. The supply crates were out of the middle of the floor where he'd been stepping around them for 2 weeks. The ledger books were stacked neatly at one end of the table instead of spread in the way they'd accumulated. No, he said. It's fine. He hung his coat, sat down, and for the first time in a long time, there was someone else's movement in the cabin at the same time as his, someone else at the stove, another cup already sitting out on the table. He found he didn't know quite what to do with that, so he picked up the ledger books and started reading where Elena had left off her analysis, and if there was something odd happening in his chest about the simple fact of another person moving around in his space, he set that aside and focused on the numbers. November turned hard before December arrived, which was not unusual for this stretch of Wyoming, but was not gentle about it either. The first real freeze came on a Tuesday. Elena knew the day because she'd been marking the calendar she'd found in the crate under the shelf, partly for her own sanity and partly because the timber letter needed to go out by a specific date, and she was tracking backward from the buyer's arrival. She woke that Tuesday to frost on the inside of the window glass and found Gideon already gone from the cabin, already out checking the cattle in the east pasture before the light had fully arrived. She got the fire up and put water on and then stood at the window drinking her first cup while the frost on the pane slowly retreated from the lower corners upward. The fence problem was on her mind. She'd been thinking about it since Gideon had confirmed the pattern. 2 previous incidents, undeniable direction of origin, no proof. She'd walked the property line twice more in the first week after arriving, both times going further toward the southeast corner where the boundary met the ridge he'd shown her. On her second walk, she'd found something she hadn't mentioned to him yet. A fire ring. Cold, old, scattered with blown debris, but deliberate. Someone had camped there and done it more than once. She turned it over while she worked the morning routine, feeding the hens, checking the water trough, bringing more wood in from the stack. Not dramatic, just steady. The kind of thinking that happens with the hands busy. When Gideon came back in from the east pasture, he was cold and slightly grim, which meant something had gone sideways. 3 head pushed through into the creek margin, he said, pulling off his gloves. Bottom rail on that section is down. I don't know if it failed or was taken down. Elena handed him a cup. Which section? He named it. She closed her eyes briefly, locating the property in her head. That's the section closest to Crow's eastern boundary, she said. He said nothing, which was confirmation. She sat down at the table. I found a fire ring on my second walk of the line, she said. Southeast corner, below the rock formation. Someone's been camping there, regularly enough to build a ring and not remove it. Gideon lowered the cup. When were you going to tell me that? I'm telling you now, she said. I wanted to think about what it meant before I said it out loud. She met his eyes. Someone has been watching this property, watching the fence line specifically, seeing what breaks when and how quickly you respond. He was quiet. They're mapping your patterns, she said. When you check which section, how fast you repair, whether you report anything. They're deciding whether you're a person who fights or a person who absorbs. What's the answer going to be? He asked, and there was something under the flatness of his voice, something tightly controlled. That depends on what we decide, she said. Right now they think they're dealing with one man alone on a contested property. They haven't had time to update that picture. She paused. I think we should let them continue thinking that a little longer. He looked at her. Why? Because the moment they know we're collecting information, they'll change their methods. Right now they're comfortable. Comfortable people make mistakes. She wrapped both hands around her cup. I want to find the man who was camping at that fire ring. I want to know who's paying him and how he communicates with Vivian Crow. And I can't find that if he knows I'm looking. The fire in the wood stove made its small sounds. Outside, the wind had found the gap in the chinking along the north wall and was doing its slow work of pushing cold air through it. Elena had flagged that on her first day. It was on the repair list. Second column, deferred. You're talking about patience, Gideon said. I'm talking about strategy, she said. Patience is the method. Strategy is the point. He was quiet for a long moment. She could see him working through it, the particular quality of his silence when he was thinking rather than just not speaking. They were different. She'd already learned that. The thinking silence was more still. The withholding silence had a texture to it, something slightly guarded. All right, he said finally. We do it your way. He paused. For now. She heard the qualifier. If something changes, you tell me before you act on it, she said. I mean that, not after. He looked at her directly. Same goes. They held each other's gaze for a second across the table, and something settled between them. Not an agreement exactly, more like the terms of a partnership being stated plainly and acknowledged plainly, and that being enough. The timber letter went out on the 14th of November. Elena wrote it at the table in the evenings over 3 nights, drafting and revising, reading sections aloud once to herself and once, on the 3rd night, to Gideon, who listened with his arms crossed and his eyes on the wall above the window, which was how he listened when he was actually paying close attention. When she finished the second read-through, he said, The clause about the weather penalties. Can they argue it's too broad? They can argue anything, she said. But I defined the term specifically enough that arguing it looks like arguing against common sense. I'd rather make them look unreasonable than give them a technical exit. She looked at the letter. It's firm, but it's not combative. You don't want to hand them an excuse to take their business elsewhere. Have you done this before? He asked. Contracts? Adjacent to it, she said. My father's supplier agreements. I drafted the language for 3 of them. She paused. He signed them, and when the other parties read them, they didn't argue. That told me something. What did it tell you? She considered that. That clarity reads as confidence, and confidence in writing makes people assume you have more options than you do. He was quiet for a moment. That's a useful thing to understand. My father thought so. She folded the letter and sealed it. He taught me a lot of things sideways, without ever saying he was teaching me. She held the letter for a moment, then set it with the outgoing correspondence she'd organized near the door. You would have liked him, I think. He was direct about most things. Not all things, but most. What wasn't he direct about? The question sat between them for a second longer than she expected. She hadn't anticipated. She'd offered the comment as a small piece of general information, not an invitation. But he'd asked, which was its own kind of departure from his usual pattern. Himself, she said finally. He was direct about work, about money, about obligations. He wasn't direct about how he was feeling about any of it. She half smiled, not happy, just true. I suppose I understand that better now than I used to. Gideon looked at her for a moment, then looked down at his coffee cup. Neither of them said anything, and after a few seconds, the conversation had moved past itself. The way conversations do when they've gone somewhere slightly further than either person intended, and both parties decide by mutual unspoken agreement to come back to solid ground. The weeks moved the way hard work makes them move, fast in the aggregate and slow in the individual day, each morning with its own list of what needed doing, and each evening with most of it done, and a few things carried forward to tomorrow. Elena renegotiated the water channel in stages, working from the storage tank backward toward the creek, replacing the cracked wooden sections first with iron pipe where the budget allowed and with better treated timber where it didn't. Gideon cut and hauled and fitted without complaint, and he was better with his hands than she'd estimated, precise in a way that suggested he'd thought about every motion before making it. She told him that once, and he said, "I grew up in a family where materials cost money we didn't have. You learn not to waste cuts." She filed that away without comment, one more piece of a man who gave out information rarely and in small quantities. The fence repairs continued. 3 more sections on the southeast boundary before November ended, all of them on the same side, all of them in locations that would allow Crow's cattle to drift onto Gideon's water access land. They repaired each one within 24 hours, which Elena had decided was the correct response. Fast enough to be clear, visible enough to be readable, but without confrontation. Let them keep cutting. Let them keep watching. She was watching too. On a Thursday in late November, she had her first real look at Vivian Crow. It happened in Caldwell, where Elena had gone alone to post the timber letter response she'd received and send a follow-up, and to pick up a part Gideon needed for the pump mechanism on the water tank. She was coming out of the post office when a black carriage came down the main street at a pace that expected people to move out of its way, and most of them did. The woman who stepped out of it at the hotel entrance was maybe 50, with good clothes worn in a way that made them look like armor rather than fashion. Everything fitted, everything dark, nothing that could be described as decorative. She had the posture of someone who had decided a long time ago that she was the tallest person in any room, regardless of the actual measurements. She spoke to the hotel owner on the front steps for approximately 45 seconds, said something that made him nod quickly and go inside ahead of her, and then swept in after him without looking at anything on the street. Except she did look at the street. Just once, just briefly, from the doorway. Her gaze moved along the street the way a person checks a room they've already decided they own, making sure nothing has been moved without permission. Her eyes passed over Elena without stopping. Elena stood on the post office steps and watched the hotel door close behind Vivian Crow, and felt the particular cold feeling of understanding something that had previously been abstract. Vivian wasn't reckless. She wasn't simply greedy. She was organized and patient, and had clearly been successful enough for long enough that other people's resistance registered to her as a minor inconvenience, something to be managed, not something to be concerned about. That was the most dangerous kind of enemy. Elena went and got the pump part and rode back to the ranch. She told Gideon about it that evening, matter-of-factly, describing what she'd seen and the impression it had left. He listened without interrupting, and when she was done, he said, "She's been in this territory 20 years, started with one herd and a dead husband's claim and built from there." "I can respect the building," Elena said. "I have a harder time with the method." "The method gets results," he said, not approvingly, just acknowledging it. "Until it doesn't." She leaned back in her chair. "She's used to people who can be worn down or bought out. She hasn't dealt with someone who isn't either." She looked at him. "Has she ever approached you directly, not through representatives?" "Once," he said, 2 years ago. She came to the property, offered a price I'll admit was fair by most measures." He paused. "I said no. She asked why. I told her this land wasn't for sale at any price." He turned his cup in his hands. She looked at me for about 5 seconds and said, "I suppose we'll see," and left. And then the fence cutting started. Not immediately, several months later. Elena thought about that. The calculation of it. The patience required to not respond immediately, to let things settle, to begin a slow pressure campaign that looked like bad luck from the outside. She's been doing this a long time, she said. Yes. Then she'll expect this to take time. Elena looked at the window, which is either our problem or our advantage, depending on how we use it. Gideon looked at her across the table. Something had shifted in how he looked at her in the past 3 weeks. Not dramatically, more like the adjustment your eyes make when the light changes and you stop having to squint. He still didn't say more than necessary, but when he did speak, the careful flatness had worn down a little at the edges, worn down to something that was still measured but less calculated. You said something about getting me into a room with the other ranchers she's been pressuring, he said. I did. I've been thinking about that. He set the cup down. There's a man named Cal Prater. He runs cattle on the west side of the ridge, about 6 miles from here. She made an offer on his water access last spring. He turned her down, and inside of 2 months his brand marks were being disputed at market. Someone filed a complaint claiming his cattle were misbranded. It cost him 2 months of sales and $100 in fees before it was resolved. Elena looked at him. Was there anything to the complaint? No, his marks are clean. He's been in this territory longer than Vivian Crow. Do you know him well? Well enough. We've shared a fence line for 8 years without trouble. Can you get me a meeting with him? She leaned forward slightly. Not to ask for anything yet, just to talk. I want to know his version, and I want him to know ours, and I want to see if there are others like him. Gideon was quiet for a moment. There's also a woman, Nora Beach. Widowed, smaller operation. She's been fighting a water rights challenge for 4 months. Nobody's proven the challenge has anything to do with Crow, but the timing is... Tell me about Nora Beach, Elena said. He did. And then they sat at the table for another hour, past the time they usually called it done for the night, because there was a larger shape becoming visible in the situation, a pattern behind the individual incidents, and once you started seeing the shape, you had to follow it to its edges, or you'd miss something important. Outside, the wind worked along the north wall of the cabin, finding its way through the gap in the chinking that was still on the deferred list. Elena noticed it and thought, that needs to come off the deferred list tomorrow. She wrote it at the top of the next page in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. Then she went back to listening to Gideon talk about Nora Beach and the water rights challenge, and she asked questions when the answers weren't clear, and between them, they started building a picture of a territory being quietly taken apart, piece by piece, by a woman who had 20 years of practice doing exactly that, and who had never yet encountered someone watching carefully enough to see the whole thing at once. Not until now. The meeting with Cal Prater happened on a Saturday, 12 days into December. Gideon had ridden over alone first, which Elena had agreed was the right approach. Showing up unannounced with a wife Cal had never met would have been too much at once. And Cal Prater was, by Gideon's description, a man who needed to warm up to a thing before he'd commit to it. So Gideon went first, explained the situation in broad strokes, and came back saying Cal would have them both to supper on Saturday if they wanted to come. They wanted to come. Cal's ranch was smaller than Gideon's, a single-story house with a long porch, a good barn, pastures that were clearly well managed even in the stripped-down state of December. He met them at the gate, a heavy-set man in his late 40s with a beard that needed attention and hands that looked like they'd been doing hard work since approximately age 10. He shook Gideon's hand and then turned to Elena with a look that was curious rather than skeptical, which she took as a reasonable starting point. So you're the one who married this man, Cal said. I am, she said. Brave, he said, and it was only half a joke. His wife, Martha, came out of the house behind him. A compact woman with red-chapped hands and flowers still on one forearm, who managed to convey, in approximately 4 seconds of looking Elena over, that she was reserving judgment but was open to being persuaded. She shook Elena's hand with a grip that meant business and said, "Come in, it's cold," which was the entirety of her welcome and was, Elena sensed, all the welcome Martha Prater gave anyone until she decided they'd earned more. Supper was beef stew and cornbread, and a silence for the first 20 minutes that was filled mostly by the sounds of eating and Cal telling Gideon about a problem he'd had with his east pasture drainage. Normal. Careful. The conversation of people who wanted to talk about the real thing, but were approaching it the long way around. Elena let it go the long way around. She helped Martha clear the plates when the meal was done, and stood in the kitchen with her for a few minutes. And Martha, apparently deciding that the clearing of plates was sufficient of good character, said without preamble, "Cal doesn't sleep right anymore, since the brand dispute." "I'm sorry," Elena said. "That kind of thing, the uncertainty of it, it stays with a person." "It does." Martha set a plate in the wash basin. "He knows it came from her. He can't prove it, and that's the part that keeps him up. Knowing something and not being able to say it in a room where it counts." "That might change," Elena said. Martha looked at her, flat, direct, with the particular quality of a woman who had been disappointed before and learned to protect herself from enthusiasm. "How?" "I don't know yet," Elena said honestly. "But I'm working on it." They looked at each other for a moment across the kitchen, and something passed between them that didn't have a name yet, but was the beginning of one. The recognition of two women who understood what it was to carry the practical weight of a situation while the men in the adjacent room talked around the edges of it. Martha handed her a dish towel. "You can dry," she said. Mads. In the main room, Cal had finally gotten to the point. "She sent a man to see me in October," he told Gideon. "Not her lawyer, what? Different man, younger, said he represented interested parties looking to consolidate holdings in the region." That was the exact phrase. Like it was a business arrangement and I was being offered a courtesy. He leaned back in his chair. "I told him to get off my property." "And the brand dispute followed," Gideon said. 6 weeks later, filed by a buyer I'd never had trouble with in 4 years of doing business. Cal turned his coffee cup in his hands. "The buyer settled it privately afterward. Apologized, said there'd been a misunderstanding, wouldn't say more than that, which tells me someone leaned on him to file, and someone else told him to let it go once the damage was done." "What was the damage?" 2 months of delayed payment, lost a contract with a hotel supplier in Cheyenne because I couldn't guarantee delivery on schedule. About $200 total, counting fees and the Cheyenne contract." He paused. "That's not nothing for an operation my size." "No," Gideon agreed. "It's not." They were quiet for a moment. The fire in Cal's hearth was better tended than Gideon's had been when Elena arrived. Someone in this house paid attention to the small maintenances. Through the kitchen doorway, they could hear the low sound of the women's voices, not the words, just the rhythm. "Nora Beach's situation is worse," Cal said. "Elena was going to ask about that. Nora doesn't have a husband to put his name on paperwork. Her water rights claim has been challenged twice in 4 months, different filers each time, but both filings written in the same language, which Nora noticed because she reads things more carefully than people expect her to." Cal stopped. "She's a smart woman. She's also about at the end of what she can afford to fight. Does she know it's Crow? She suspects. She's got no proof, same as the rest of us." He looked at Gideon. "What are you thinking of doing?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Elena thinks we should be building a picture, documentation, pattern of behavior that establishes a connection between Crow and the individual incidents." Cal made a sound that was somewhere between agreement and skepticism. "That takes time." "Yes." "And meanwhile she keeps picking away." "Yes." Another silence. Cal rubbed the side of his face. Outside, the December wind moved through the gap under his porch door and rattled it briefly before dying down. "I've got records," he said finally. "The brand dispute. I kept everything, every letter, every filing, every date. I kept it because Martha said I should and I couldn't argue with her." He looked at Gideon. "If this gets to the point where records matter, I'll give you access to mine." "That's all I'm asking right now," Gideon said. Elena appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had the dish towel still in her hand and she looked at Cal directly. "I want to meet Nora Beach," she said, "as soon as it can be arranged." Cal glanced at Gideon, then back at her. "I can send word to her." "Tell her I'm not coming to ask anything of her," Elena said. "Tell her I just want to understand her situation, that's all." Cal studied her for a moment with the particular look of a man reassessing a first impression. "All right," he said. "I'll send word." Nora Beach turned out to be a 44-year-old woman who ran 30 head of cattle on 160 acres that backed up against a seasonal creek, or what had been a seasonal creek until someone filed a claim asserting that the water flow through Nora's property was subject to prior appropriation rights held by a shell company called the Harlan Valley Water Trust, which had appeared in the territory's land records approximately 8 months ago and whose actual ownership was not listed in any public document Elena could find. She went looking for those documents herself, in the Territorial Records Office in Caldwell, on a Thursday when Gideon was managing a fence repair and the weather had decided to be cooperative for once. The records clerk was a young man named Willis, who was deeply bored by his work in the way that people become when the work is repetitive but requires enough attention to prevent full disengagement. He found Elena's interest in the water trust filings mildly interesting simply because nothing about this job was ever interesting, and he pulled 3 additional files when she asked for them without requiring the usual formal request process. The Harlan Valley Water Trust had been filed by a lawyer named Denholm Pierce, whose office was in Cheyenne. He appeared on 3 other filings in the county records, all of them within the last 14 months. All of them water or land access claims against smaller operations in the northeastern corner of the territory. Elena wrote down every reference number, every date, every name that appeared as signatory or witness. She also found in a land transfer file from 16 months prior a document recording the sale of a 40-acre parcel on the east side of the ridge from a family named Cortland to a buyer listed only as V. Crow Holdings, represented by D. Pierce Escrosh. She set the file down on the records table and looked at the wall above it for a moment. 16 months ago. The parcel sat directly between Vivian Crow's main holdings and the southeastern corner of Gideon's property. The corner where someone had been camping at a fire ring. The corner where the fence cutting had started. It wasn't proof of anything by itself, but it was a thread, and threads could be followed. She thanked Willis and rode back to the ranch in a cold wind with her notebook full and her mind running ahead of the horse. She told Gideon that evening. He listened the same way he always listened, still, focused, letting her finish before he spoke. "Pierce," he said when she was done. "You know the name? He handled the land assessment dispute that came up on my property 4 years ago. Someone filed a claim that my eastern boundary marker was misplaced. It got dropped before it went anywhere, but the filing came from Pierce's office." He looked at her. "I didn't connect it at the time. It didn't go anywhere, so I didn't think about it further." Elena felt the back of her neck go cold. She's been building toward this for at least 4 years. Longer, maybe. I just can't see further back than what's documented. She sat down, pressed her hands flat on the table. She's not impatient. She's been laying groundwork, establishing legal infrastructure, placing a land purchase to put an asset between her and your boundary, filing harassment claims against neighbors to soften the surrounding properties. It's a campaign. She paused. A slow, systematic campaign, which has been working, Gideon said, with the particular bluntness of a man who didn't soften things because softening them didn't change them. Nora's close to breaking. Cal took $200 in losses. 2 other properties on the ridge have sold in the last 3 years to buyers I couldn't identify. Elena looked at him. "Did you try to identify them at the time?" "No," he said. "I didn't know what I was looking at." She nodded. "Neither did any of them, individually. That's the design. Each incident looks isolated, a brand dispute, a water claim, a boundary question. Nobody's looking at the whole map because nobody has the whole map." She tapped the notebook. "Until now." He was quiet for a moment. The fire in the wood stove worked steadily. Outside, the first real snowfall of December had begun, quiet and without ceremony, settling on the canyon walls and the fence posts and the frozen ground of the yard. "What do we do with it?" he asked. "We fill in more of the map," she said. "I need to see Nora. I need to see those water rights filings directly, not just the numbers I found in the records. And I need to know if there's anyone else who's got documentation of anything connected to Pierce or the Water Trust." She looked at the window. The snow was coming in sideways now, slight and dry. "And then at some point we need to decide what we're building toward, because documentation is only useful if you have a place to deliver it." "Territorial office?" Gideon said. "Land commissioner. Or a lawyer who isn't Denholm Pierce." "There's a man in Casper," Gideon said slowly. "Frank Alderman. He handled a case against a mining company for water contamination a few years back. Won it." He paused. "He's not cheap." "We're not at the point of needing him yet," Elena said. "But I want to know how to reach him." Gideon nodded. They sat with the snowfall outside and the fire inside, and the notebook full of dates and reference numbers between them. And neither of them said what they were both thinking. that they were building something serious now, something that had moved past property protection into open opposition to a woman with 20 years of practice and considerably more resources than either of them. They were thinking it. They just knew it loud and give it too much weight before they were ready to carry it. The fire started on a Wednesday night, 3 weeks into December, at 20 minutes past midnight. Gideon woke to the smell first. Not smoke exactly, more the specific wrongness of heat in a place heat shouldn't be. He was out of the bunk and at the window before he was fully conscious, and he saw the orange light against the snow and knew what it was before his brain had fully caught up. The hay barn. He was out the door in his boots and his coat over his long underwear. No time for more than that, and the cold hit him like a wall as he crossed the yard. The barn's east wall was already gone. Not gone, but the fire had eaten through the wooden slats and was working on the support beams, and the hay inside, dry from a summer of careful storage, was feeding it with a particular efficiency that fire has when it finds exactly the fuel it wants. Elena! He didn't know if she'd heard him from inside the cabin. He turned back and she was already in the doorway, dressed faster than he'd expected, and she saw his face and the light behind him and said nothing, just came across the yard at a run. They worked without instructions, the way people work when the task is obvious and there's no time for anything else. Gideon broke open the water line from the storage tank while Elena grabbed the 2 pails from the side of the barn that weren't yet in the fire's reach. The temperature was well below freezing and the ground was iced over and the footing was terrible, and none of that was a consideration because the hay stored in that barn was survival. It was the winter feed for 40 head of cattle, and without it they were looking at a different kind of disaster than fire. They couldn't save the east wall. They couldn't save perhaps a third of what was stored there. What they could do was stop the fire from taking the west section, which they did, working in relay with the pails and the water line until the fire had used what it could reach and ran out of the path they'd denied it. It took an hour and 40 minutes. Elena's hand stopped hurting at some point in the middle of that hour, which she recognized as the cold taking over from the pain, which was its own kind of warning she didn't have the capacity to respond to right then. When it was done, they stood in the snow and the smoke and looked at what remained. 2/3 of the west section, a structure that was still standing but was compromised along the east face in ways that would need assessment in daylight. The smell of burned hay, thick in the frozen air. Elena became aware of her hands again as the work stopped, the pain returning as some kind of warmth tried to come back. She pressed them under her arms. Gideon was looking at the burned section. She watched his face in the light from the still smoldering remnants. He had a cut on his left forearm from something, a nail or a piece of broken wood. She hadn't seen it happen. He hadn't mentioned it. The blood had frozen on his skin in a thin, dark line. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" she asked. "No." He looked at her. "Your hands." "They'll be fine," she said, which was not certain but was the right answer for right now. He looked at the barn. "We lost maybe a third of the winter stores." "Yes, that's manageable if the weather doesn't run longer than average." He said it the way he said most things, flat, factual, already calculating. "It'll be close." "I know." She looked at the burned wall. The snow was still falling, lighter now, and it drifted against the blackened edges of the wood with a pointless delicacy. She stood there looking at it for a long moment, and then she said, "Gideon?" "Yeah." "This wasn't an accident." He turned to look at her. "The fire started at the east wall," she said. "The interior east wall, below the vent line. If it had started from inside the hay, a lantern left, heat accumulation, anything like that, it would have started higher and spread outward. This spread inward." She met his eyes. Someone set it at the wall from outside. He was quiet. His jaw was tight. "I want to look at the exterior in the morning," she said. "When there's light." "We'll look," he said. They went inside. Elena got the wood stove burning high and stood in front of it with her hands extended, and the returning sensation in her fingers was unpleasant in the specific way that cold damage coming back always is. Gideon sat at the table with his arm out and let her wrap the cut with cloth without being asked, and she wrapped it without ceremony, pulling the knot tight enough to hold. Neither of them slept again that night. At first light, Elena went back outside with Gideon, and they walked the exterior of the burned wall together, and she found what she was looking for in less than 10 minutes, a scorched area at the base of the east wall, exterior side, where the fire had clearly begun. The snow around it was disturbed in a pattern that wasn't consistent with wind. There were partial impressions in the packed earth near the tree line, blurred by the new snowfall, but present. 2 sets of boot prints, or possibly one person making 2 passes. She crouched down and looked at the base of the wall. There was a glass fragment in the snow 3 feet from the burn origin. She picked it up carefully. "Bottle," she said, holding it up. "The kind you'd put oil in." Gideon stood behind her and looked at it. She felt the stillness in him that was different from his usual quiet. This was the stillness of a man trying very hard to manage something large that was pushing against the inside of his chest. "All right," he said after a moment. His voice was controlled, but only just. "What do we do?" Elena stood up. She had the glass fragment in her palm, and the snow was starting again, fine and relentless. And she looked at the damaged barn and the scorched wall and the ruined stores that would make this winter tight in a way that would require careful management to survive. She thought about Vivian Crow standing on the hotel steps in Caldwell, with the posture of a woman who had never yet found a wall she couldn't eventually go around or through. "We don't react yet," she said. He made a sound, not agreement, not disagreement, somewhere in between, with effort visible in it. "I know," she said. "I know that's hard." "Hard," he said flatly, "is a word for it. But if we react now, we react without enough to back it up. We look like we're making accusations we can't prove, and she uses that." Elena closed her fingers around the glass fragment. "We need the saboteur, not Crow. The man who was camping at the fire ring, the man who's been cutting our fences, the man who was out here last night. If we can put a name to him, we can put a chain from him to her." She looked at Gideon. Someone in Caldwell knows who she hires for work she doesn't want connected to her name. Someone always knows. "And you're going to find that person," he said. "I'm going to try." She slipped the glass into her coat pocket. "But first I need to go see Nora Beach. Today, if possible." He looked at her for a long moment. There were dark circles under his eyes from the sleepless night, and the wrapped cut on his arm, and the cold coming off the ruined barn, and he looked like a man absorbing a serious blow with his feet still under him. "I'll ride with you," he said. "Cal's closer to Nora's place than we are," Elena said. "He can come too. I want all 3 of you in the room when I talk to her." She looked at him directly. "We've been building a picture. Now we need to start turning it into something that can move." He held her gaze for a second. Then he nodded, once the same way he'd nodded in Emmett Hale's office over the paperwork. A decision made and committed to. They went inside to get ready. The glass fragment sat in Elena's coat pocket, and the snow covered the burn marks slowly, patiently, the way snow covers everything in this country, without care for what's underneath, without judgment about what happened here. But Elena cared, and Elena had a very good memory for details that other people assumed were already buried. Nora Beach lived 6 miles east of Cal Prater's place, which put her almost exactly in the center of the triangle that Vivian Crow had been quietly drawing around the northeastern holdings for the better part of 2 years. Elena understood that geography better now than she had even a week ago, and riding toward Nora's property through the gray December morning, with the snow from the previous night still unbroken on the open ground, she kept the map of it in her head. The parcels, the water lines, the boundary claims, the slow, patient pressure applied to each point in sequence. Gideon rode beside her without talking. He'd been quieter than usual since the barn, which was saying something, and Elena had decided not to push on it. There was a particular kind of anger that needed to burn down to a workable temperature before a man like Gideon could do anything useful with it, and pushing on it before that happened would only waste both of them. Cal met them at the junction of the 2 trails, as arranged, and fell in beside them with a nod and no preamble. He looked at Gideon and read the situation accurately enough to say nothing about the barn except, "How bad?" And when Gideon said, "a third of the winter stores," Cal made a sound that conveyed everything necessary, and they rode the rest of the way without discussing it further. Nora Beach came out onto her porch when she heard horses. She was shorter than Elena had imagined from Cal's description, compact and angular, with iron gray hair pulled back severely, and eyes that assessed things with the speed of someone who'd learned early that hesitation was expensive. She was maybe 44 or 45, though the years on a working property alone could add or subtract a decade from how a person appeared, and Elena knew better than to guess with any confidence. She looked at the three of them on horseback and said, "Cal?" Then she looked at Elena specifically, the way women sometimes look at each other when they're deciding whether what they're seeing matches what they were told to expect. "Come in," she said. "I've got coffee." Her house was tidy in the functional way. Not decorative, not particularly warm in feel, but organized with the clear logic of someone who lived alone and had learned that disorder cost time she couldn't spare. There were papers on the table when they came in, which she stacked and set aside, and Elena caught a glimpse of the top page before Nora moved it, a legal filing, dense with language, with several lines underscored in pencil. They sat with coffee, and Nora looked at Elena directly. "Cal said you've been building a picture," she said. "Yes." "Show me what you have." Elena had brought the notebook. She went through it methodically. The records office findings, the Harlan Valley Water Trust filings, the connection to Denholm Pierce, the pattern of timing between Crow's property acquisition and the subsequent harassment of adjacent landowners. She didn't editorialize. She just presented the sequence and let Nora see the shape of it. Nora listened with her arms crossed and her eyes moving between the notebook and Elena's face, checking both simultaneously, the way a careful person reads two sources at once to verify. When Elena finished, Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she got up, went to the stack of papers she'd set aside, and pulled out a file from the bottom. She put it on the table. "The second water challenge," she said, "filed 6 weeks ago. Look at page 3. Elena opened it to page 3. There was a reference citation at the bottom of the third paragraph, a case number from a prior appropriation ruling in Harlan County, dated 14 months ago. The ruling had established the precedent the current filing was using to challenge Nora's access. Elena looked at the case number, then she looked at the date. Then she looked up at Nora. "This precedent was established 2 months before the Harlan Valley Water Trust was filed," Elena said. "Yes." Nora sat back down. "Someone set up the legal precedent first, then created the entity that would use it. In the right sequence so that by the time the trust filed against me, the foundation for the challenge already existed in county records." She looked at Elena steadily. "That's not opportunism. That's planning." Gideon said from his end of the table, "How long ago did you figure that out?" 3 weeks ago, Nora said, "when I had time to read all of it carefully, instead of just responding to the pieces." She paused. "I don't have a lawyer. The one I consulted in October told me the challenge had enough legal grounding to require a formal defense, and his fee for that defense was $160. She set her cup down. "I don't have $160. The silence that followed had weight. Cal said, "Well, Gideon knows a lawyer in Casper." Nora looked at Gideon. "Is he good?" "He won a contamination case against a mining company," Gideon said. "They had more lawyers than he did." "What does he charge?" "I don't know yet," Gideon said. "We haven't contacted him." Nora absorbed that. She looked at the file on the table, then at Elena. "What are you trying to build toward?" "Specifically." "A consolidated complaint," Elena said. "Multiple landowners, documented pattern of coordinated harassment, provable connection to a single organizing source." She paused. "And a name for the man doing the groundwork. The fence cutting, the fire." "There was a fire?" Nora asked. "Last night," Cal said quietly. "Hay barn." Nora looked at Gideon. Something moved in her expression. Something that had seen enough of this kind of deliberate harm to recognize it immediately and feel the specific exhaustion that came with that recognition. "You're sure it wasn't accidental?" "We found the origin point and a glass fragment from an oil bottle," Elena said. "It was set from outside the east wall." Nora was quiet for a moment. "His name is Roy Selden," she said. The room went still. Elena set her pen down. "You know him." "I know of him. He did work for a property outfit in the southern part of the county 3 years ago. The kind of work that doesn't get written down. A man in Caldwell told me about him when my fence line was first cut in September. He said Selden had been seen around the northeastern properties, that he'd worked similar jobs for hire in 2 other counties." Nora looked at them steadily. "I didn't say anything because I had no proof, and I was already fighting the water claim, and I couldn't—" She stopped. "I should have said something." "You're saying it now," Elena said. She picked up the pen. "Tell me everything you know about Roy Selden." "Selden was a drifter by trade and a problem maker by hire. The kind of man who existed in the margins of every territory, useful to people who needed things done at a distance from their own name. Nora's information was limited. A physical description from the Caldwell man who'd mentioned him, a connection to a previous property harassment campaign in Johnson County, and the name of a saloon in Caldwell where he'd reportedly been seen twice in October. It wasn't much, but it was a thread, which was more than they'd had that morning. They stayed at Nora's for 2 hours. By the time they left, they had an agreement. Informal, nothing written, but genuine in the way agreements are when they're made between people who understand what's at stake. Nora would provide her complete file of the water rights challenges. Cal would prepare a written account of the brand dispute, signed and dated. Gideon would make contact with Frank Alderman in Casper, and Elena would find Roy Selden. She didn't announce that last part as a plan. She just knew it was the next necessary thing, and she held it quietly as they rode back in the early afternoon, the sky gone the color of old pewter, the temperature dropping as the light thinned. "Selden," Gideon said, after they'd ridden a mile in silence. "Yes. You're thinking of going to Caldwell." "I'm thinking about it," she said carefully. He was quiet for a moment. Not alone. She didn't argue with that, which surprised him slightly. "When?" he asked. 2 days. I need to think about how to approach it first." She looked ahead at the trail. A woman asking questions in a saloon about a man for hire is either conspicuous or invisible, depending entirely on how she carries herself. I need to decide which one is more useful. Gideon glanced at her. What does that mean exactly? It means I need to think about it, she said again. And there was a finality in it that he recognized. Not dismissal, just the edge of her process, the point past which she needed space to work something through without talking about it. He'd learned to recognize that edge. He left it alone. She thought about it for a day and a half, and what she came up with was simple enough to feel almost obvious in hindsight. She didn't go to the saloon as a woman asking questions. She went as a woman delivering something, specifically a message for the feed merchant 2 doors down, which was a genuine errand that gave her a genuine reason to be on that section of the street at that time of day. The saloon and the feed merchant shared an alley entrance at the back, and the alley was where men who didn't want to be observed from the street often stood to smoke or talk. Gideon came with her and went to the land office, which gave him a reason to be in Caldwell that had nothing to do with her errand and kept them from looking like they were moving together. She did the feed merchant errand first, legitimate, unhurried, then she came back through the alley. There were 2 men in the alley. One was clearly a saloon employee. Apron, taking a break, paying no attention to anything. The other was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low, which was either the posture of someone resting or the posture of someone who didn't want to be looked at from either end of the alley. Elena walked through at a normal pace and glanced at him as people glance at strangers, briefly, without emphasis. He was somewhere in his late 30s, lean, with the weathered look of someone who spent significant time outdoors, and there was a quality to the stillness of him that was not relaxation. It was the stillness of someone accustomed to waiting. She went to the street end of the alley and stopped, as if checking the direction she needed, and then came back through the alley a second time because she'd come out the wrong end, which was the kind of small domestic confusion that made a woman invisible to most men. On the second pass, she looked at his boots. They were distinctive, unusual heel construction, a repair on the left toe done in a different leather than the rest of the boot. The kind of detail that a boot picks up over years of particular use and doesn't replicate. She'd seen that boot print before, or something close enough to it. At the fire ring, on her second walk of the southeast boundary, back in November. The frost had blurred it, but the unusual heel had registered enough that she'd noted it in the margin of her page. She went to the street and breathed through the cold air for a moment. Then she went to find Gideon. Otto. She found him coming out of the land office, and she told him what she'd seen in 4 sentences, keeping her voice low and her posture unhurried, 2 people talking on a street. He listened. Then he said, "Are you sure about the boot?" "No," she said honestly, "but I'm sure enough to want a name." She looked at him. "Is there anyone at the land office who knows people by sight? Someone who'd know a drifter who's been in the area since September?" Gideon thought for a moment. Willis at the records office knows more than he lets on. He's been there 4 years and he pays attention because there's not much else to do. Can you talk to him without it looking like a question about Selden specifically? I can try. She nodded. I'll wait at the general store. Willis, as it turned out, knew Roy Selden by name. Not well. He'd processed a work permit application from Selden in October, some kind of seasonal labor documentation that Selden apparently carried to make himself look legitimate when he needed to. Willis described him with the accuracy of someone who processed paperwork and noticed faces as a professional habit: height, build, the unusual boots, a thin scar along the right jawline. The boots matched. Gideon came back to the general store and told her, and Elena stood at the counter with a list of goods she was buying and processed this information with her hand still moving through the supply list, not stopping, not changing her expression in any way that would be readable to the shopkeeper. He's still in the area, she said. Willis said he saw him 3 days ago, which means he's waiting to see what we do after the fire. She set a tin of salt on the counter, which means he's still in contact with whoever is paying him. Crow, or Pierce on her behalf. She looked at Gideon. If we can place Selden, we can work backward from him. Who's he staying with? Who's he talking to? Whether there's any payment trail. She paused. But we need someone with more reach than us to do that part. Alderman, Gideon said. Alderman, she agreed. It's time. The letter to Frank Alderman in Casper went out the next morning. Gideon wrote it himself, at Elena's suggestion. A man's name on the initial contact would get a faster read from a lawyer who didn't know them. Elena drafted the language and Gideon copied it in his own hand, which felt slightly absurd but was the kind of practical concession to reality that neither of them spent much time resenting. The letter laid out the situation in plain terms. Documented pattern of property harassment across multiple landowners, identifiable connection to Denholm Pierce, suspected arson, named individual suspected of acting as hired saboteur. They asked for a consultation and a fee estimate, and they gave Alderman the reference number of the mining case so he'd know they'd done their research. While the letter was in transit, Elena kept moving. She visited Nora twice more in the following week, going through the water rights filings page by page, building a chronology that placed every filing in relation to every other document she'd collected. The picture was getting sharper. Pierce had filed the Harlan Valley Water Trust using a legal precedent he'd manufactured, a prior appropriation claim that referenced a water use agreement between two parties, one of whom Elena could not locate in any county record she could access. She wrote to the Territorial Surveyor's Office in Cheyenne requesting documentation of that agreement. She also wrote to the county where Selden had allegedly worked the previous harassment campaign in Johnson County, requesting copies of any complaints filed against persons unknown during that period. She didn't expect a fast response. She sent it anyway. Gideon managed the ranch through all of this with the stubborn competence that was his baseline, repairing the barn's east wall in stages between the weather's intermittent cooperation, managing the reduced winter stores with calculations Elena helped him run twice a week, checking the fence line on the southeast boundary every 3 days. The fence held. Whoever was watching, whatever Selden was waiting for, nothing new happened in those 2 weeks, which was its own kind of pressure, the particular tension of waiting for the next thing when you knew there would be a next thing. Alderman's response came on a Friday, 12 days after they'd sent the letter. It was 2 pages, which was longer than Gideon had expected, and the fee he named for a formal consultation was $40, which was less than either of them had feared. More importantly, the letter contained a paragraph that changed the temperature of the room when Elena read it aloud. Alderman had encountered Denholm Pierce before, not personally, professionally, in the paper trail of a land consolidation dispute in Laramie County 4 years prior. Pierce had acted as a legal architect for a similar scheme there. Shell entities, manufactured precedents, coordinated harassment. And the scheme had ultimately collapsed when one of the hired men made a statement to a territorial officer in exchange for immunity on a separate charge. He's done this before, Gideon said. He almost lost it once before, Elena said, which was the more important point. Which means there's a pattern, and patterns leave records, and records in 2 counties are harder to dismiss than records in 1. She set the letter down. I need to get to Casper. He looked at her. That's 4 days' ride. 3.5 if the weather cooperates. She met his eyes. Alderman needs to see what we have in person. The chronology, the filings, everything. A letter is too slow for this stage. He was quiet for a moment, working through the timing, the ranch, the winter stores, the ongoing fence monitoring. I can't leave the property for 4 days right now, he said. Not an accusation, just the arithmetic of what they were managing. I know, she said. I'm not asking you to. He looked at her. You'd go alone. I've traveled alone before. Elena. His voice had a quality she didn't hear from him often. Not soft exactly, but with the careful deliberateness of someone choosing words that were more direct than their usual. The man who burned our barn is still in this county. She registered the word. Our. It sat between them briefly. Selden's target is the property, she said. Not me, specifically. And if I'm not here, there's less reason for him to move. She kept her voice even. You'll be here. The property is more secure with you on it than with both of us traveling. He didn't argue with the logic. He didn't like it, which was visible in the particular set of his shoulders, but he didn't argue. Take Cal's horse, he said. Yours is slower. I was going to ask Cal if I could borrow it, yes. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, Come back in one piece. That's the plan, she said. She left 2 days later, early enough that the light was barely up when she rode out of the yard. Gideon stood at the fence and watched her go, which was something she didn't see because she didn't look back. Not because she didn't want to, but because she'd found, in the weeks since arriving at this ranch on foot with a dead man's letter, that looking back had a tendency to make the forward distance feel larger than it actually was. She kept her eyes on the trail and rode. Casper in December was cold with a hard urban edge to it, bigger than Caldwell, noisier, with the particular energy of a place where commerce and law and ambition all occupied the same few streets and created friction between them. Elena arrived on the third afternoon, later than she'd hoped because the second day's weather had not cooperated, and went directly to Alderman's office, above a printer's shop on the main commercial street. Frank Alderman was not what she'd pictured from his letter. He was younger, early 40s, with the slightly rumpled quality of a man who thought faster than he dressed. Ink on his left cuff, wire-rimmed glasses pushed up on his forehead in the way of someone who'd forgotten they were there. He stood when she came in and looked at her with the same rapid assessment quality that she'd noticed in Nora Beach, two types of people who'd learned to read situations quickly because the situations hadn't always been gentle. Mrs. Vale, he said. Mr. Alderman. She set her bag on the chair he indicated and pulled out the document folder she'd organized before leaving. I brought everything. He sat down. Let's see it. She walked him through it the same way she'd walked Nora through the notebook. Methodical, no editorializing, letting the sequence speak. Alderman was a different kind of listener than Nora. He interrupted more, but the interruptions were questions that went deeper into specific documents, specific dates, specific legal implications. He pulled out 2 reference books from his shelf midway through and cross-checked 3 things without breaking the flow of what Elena was presenting, which told her he was taking it seriously. When she finished, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Pierce is good, he said. He builds these things to look clean from the outside. Every individual component is defensible on its own. It's only the pattern that reveals the intent. Which is why we need multiple complainants, Elena said. Yes. He came back down from the ceiling and looked at her. The arson changes the equation. Harassment and fraudulent filings are one kind of case. Arson is another. If you can place Selden at the fire, physical evidence, witness, anything, that becomes a criminal matter, not just a civil one. And a criminal investigation of Selden creates pressure for him to give up his employer. That's what I was thinking, Elena said. He looked at the glass fragment she'd placed on his desk. You kept this. Yes. Smart. He turned it in his fingers. It's not enough on its own, but it establishes the origin method if we have a witness or a statement to pair it with. He set it down. Can you get me Nora Beach's filings directly? I'll have them sent. And the Cal Prater account of the brand dispute signed. Already prepared. He studied her for a moment. You did a significant amount of legal groundwork before you came to me, Mrs. Vale. I didn't know if we could afford you, she said. I wanted to come with something worth your time. He almost smiled. $40 for the consultation, he said. If we go to formal representation, it's more, but let's see what the territorial commissioner says first. There's a man in the land office there named Hicks who has been looking for a credible case against Pierce for 2 years. He paused. He might be very interested in what you've brought me. Elena felt something shift in the room. Not dramatically, not the way it shifted in stories, but the quiet, practical shift of a situation that has been moving in one direction for a long time, beginning, slowly, to turn. How do we approach Hicks? She asked. Carefully, Alderman said, and with everything documented twice. He reached for his pen. Tell me again about the chronology of the Water Trust filings, from the beginning. She told him again. Outside, Casper went about its December business, indifferent to the conversation happening above the printer's shop, indifferent to the slow, careful dismantling of a campaign that had been running for years. That was fine. Indifference was fine. Elena didn't need the town to care. She needed the documents to be in the right hands at the right time, and she needed Roy Selden to still be in Harlan County when she got back, and she needed the weather to hold for the return ride. 2 of those 3 things were in her control. She stayed focused on those. She made it back in 3.5 days, the same as she'd estimated, though the last 12 miles were into a headwind that made the horse unhappy and her face numb by the time the canyon walls came into view. She saw the smoke from the cabin's chimney before she saw the cabin itself, and something in her chest released a tension she hadn't fully acknowledged carrying for the entire trip. Gideon was at the barn when she rode in. He came out when he heard hoofbeats and stood in the yard, and she could see him doing the same rapid check she'd done from the ridge, looking for signs of how the ride had gone, reading her posture before she'd said a word. "You're back," he said. "I said I would be." She dismounted, stiff from the cold, and handed him the reins. "Alderman is good. Better than good." "Come inside first," he said. "You're frozen." She was, a little. She went inside and stood in front of the wood stove while he put the horse up, and when he came in, she was already at the table with her coat off and the document folder open, which made him stop in the doorway with an expression that was somewhere between exasperated and something she was starting to recognize as a different thing entirely. "5 minutes," he said. "I'm fine." "Elena." He said it with a particular weight. 5 minutes. She looked at him. He put water on for coffee and hung up his coat and sat down across from her, and she closed the folder and let him pour the coffee and hand her a cup before she started talking. It was, she reflected, a reasonable compromise. She told him everything: Alderman's assessment, the connection to the Laramie County case, the introduction of Commissioner Hicks as a potential avenue, the implications of the arson for elevating the matter from civil to criminal. Gideon listened with his hands around his own cup, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment in the thinking kind of way, rather than the withholding kind. "Hicks," he said. "I've heard that name at the land office. Older man. Been in the territorial position a long time. Alderman says he's been building a file on Pierce for 2 years, but hasn't had a consolidated case to act on. Individual complaints are too easy to dismiss. What he needs is exactly what we're building. Multiple complainants, documented pattern, a direct line between Pierce and the incidents on the ground." "Selden," Gideon said. "Selden is the chain link," she said. "Pierce to Crow to Selden to the fence cutting and the fire. If Alderman can get Hicks to open an investigation, there's pressure on Selden from the criminal side. And a man like Selden," she paused. "He's a hireling, not a loyalist. He'll trade what he knows for what he needs, the same as the man did in Laramie County." Gideon turned his cup in his hands. "And Crow?" "Crow falls when Selden talks, and when Pierce's shell entities are exposed." Elena held his gaze. "This doesn't happen fast. Alderman was clear about that. We're looking at months, not weeks." He absorbed that with the particular stillness of a man who had already decided to see something through and was simply acknowledging the length of the road. "What do we need to do next?" "Nora's filings go to Alderman this week. Cal's signed account goes with them. And we need to be at the territorial office in Caldwell on the 15th. Alderman is sending a letter to Hicks directly, and he wants representatives of the complainants present when Hicks reads it." "All of us?" "Ideally. You, me, Cal, Nora." She paused. "There's strength in showing up together. Hicks needs to see that this isn't one aggrieved rancher making accusations. He needs to see a group of people who have been separately and systematically targeted and who have come together because they figured out what the targets had in common." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Cal will come. Nora? He hesitated. Nora's proud. She doesn't like being seen as someone who needs help. She's not coming for help, Elena said. She's coming because she has information that no one else has and without which the case is incomplete. That's different. She looked at him. Tell her that. Use those words. He studied her. You know how to frame things for people. My father called it understanding what a person needs to hear versus what you need to say, she said. They're not always the same thing. He was quiet for a second, and something moved in his expression that she didn't immediately know what to do with. Your father was a good teacher, he said finally. He was, she said. I didn't know it while he was doing it. The 15th came with clear weather, which felt like an indulgence the territory rarely offered in December. All four of them rode into Caldwell. Elena and Gideon, Cal with Martha, who had insisted on coming and whom nobody argued with, and Nora alone on a horse that was better than everything else about her financial situation, because Nora Beach had inherited that horse from her husband and would sell the land before she sold the animal. Commissioner Hicks operated out of 2 rooms on the 2nd floor of the Territorial Land Office, which was a more modest space than the title suggested, a desk with papers stacked in a system only Hicks understood, 2 chairs for visitors, which meant some of them stood, and a window that looked out onto the main street in which Hicks apparently watched with the peripheral attention of a man who had learned that what happened on the street was often connected to what landed on his desk. He was in his early 60s, gray-haired, with the deliberate quality of someone who had spent decades watching people present their situations and had learned to separate the presentation from the substance. He read Alderman's letter in front of them, which took 7 minutes, and then he set it down and looked at the group assembled in his insufficient office space. Mr. Alderman has a reputation for accuracy, Hicks said. When he says a pattern exists, in my experience, a pattern exists. He looked at each of them in turn. How many of you have written documentation of the incidents described in this letter? 3 hands. His eyes stopped on Nora. Mrs. Beach, your water rights challenges, you have the original filings? Everything, Nora said. Dated, organized, including the precedent case that was filed 14 months before the trust challenge. She paused. I can also give you the name of the buyer in Cheyenne who pulled back from a purchase agreement with me in October after someone, I can't say who, apparently suggested my water access was legally uncertain. Hicks looked at her for a moment. You held on to that. I hold on to things, Nora said. Something shifted in Hicks's expression. Respect, maybe, or the particular recognition of someone who understood what it cost a person in Nora's position to have held on to all of it through months of pressure and financial strain, and the particular loneliness of fighting something you couldn't yet name in a room where your name alone didn't carry weight. I'm going to be direct with you, Hicks said, leaning back. I cannot open a formal investigation based on a letter from Frank Alderman and 4 people standing in my office. What I can do is request documentation from the county records on the Harlan Valley Water Trust and trigger a standard review of Denholm Pierce's filings under the Territorial Oversight Statute, which he won't be able to see coming because it falls under administrative review, not legal challenge. He looked at Elena specifically. The arson is the piece that changes the category. That's a criminal matter. Who has the physical evidence? I do, Elena said. She set the glass fragment on his desk. He looked at it without touching it. I documented the origin point of the fire the morning after, she said. Boot prints, the burn pattern, the exterior location of the ignition. It's all written and dated. She set the notebook page, the original, not a copy, beside the fragment. The man we believe is responsible is named Roy Selden. He was in Caldwell as recently as 3 weeks ago. There's a work permit filed in his name at the records office in October. Willis processed it. He can confirm the physical description. Hicks looked at the glass, then at the notebook page, then at Elena. You've done considerable work, Mrs. Vale. The ranch almost lost its winter stores, she said, and it wasn't the first time someone has tried to wear us down. I decided I'd rather be useful than angry. He looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up the glass fragment and the notebook page and placed them on the clear corner of his desk, separate from everything else. I'll need the full document package from each of you, he said. Everything Alderman listed. I'll also need a formal written statement on the arson. Signed, witnessed, which I'll have my clerk prepare before you leave today. He paused. This is going to take time. I won't promise you a timeline I can't keep. We understand that, Gideon said. It was almost the first thing he'd said since they'd entered the room, and Hicks looked at him with the attention of someone recalibrating. This is your land she's been after, Hicks said. It is. And you came in through the lawyer and the documentation instead of through my door 6 months ago with a grievance and nothing behind it. Gideon paused. My wife's idea, he said. Hicks looked at Elena. Then he said, with the particular dryness of a man who had seen enough poorly constructed cases to understand the value of a well-constructed one, your wife has good instincts. I know, Gideon said. Roy Selden was located in late January. It was not Elena who found him, and it was not Gideon. It was a territorial deputy working in conjunction with the criminal complaint Hicks had formally opened in the second week of January following his administrative review of Pierce's filings, which had turned up 2 instances of what he had described to aldermen in a letter as documentary irregularities significant enough to warrant full examination. Selden was found in a boarding house in a small settlement 30 miles south of Caldwell, which was far enough to suggest he'd been planning to move on and close enough to suggest he hadn't quite managed it yet. Alderman sent word to Gideon and Elena on a Friday morning. He included one additional sentence at the end of his letter. Selden has requested to speak with the territorial prosecutor. I expect we will know considerably more within 2 weeks. Elena read the letter at the table. Gideon read it over her shoulder. They were both quiet for a moment. It's not over, she said. No, he agreed. But it moved. She set the letter down. Outside, January had made the land look stripped to its essential structure. The canyon walls bare, the trees without anything to offer, the snow on the ground that had been there long enough to compact into something that was more ice than snow. But there was light at a different angle than there had been in December. Not spring yet, not even the suggestion of it. Just the faint shift in the quality of the afternoon light that meant the worst of winter had peaked and was, however slowly, beginning to release its hold. 2 weeks turned into 3 before Alderman sent the next letter, which was longer, 4 pages, and which Elena and Gideon read at the table with coffee going cold beside them because neither of them stopped to drink it. Selden had talked. Not everything, not cleanly, not in the cooperative spirit of a man who felt remorse, in the practical spirit of a man calculating what he could get for what he had. But what he gave the territorial prosecutor was enough. A direct communication chain between himself and Denholm Pierce, carried through a third party in Caldwell, a man who ran a freight operation and passed messages for additional income that he was now also speaking to authorities about, with similar calculations running behind his eyes. Payment records, not formal but traceable, cash amounts that corresponded to dates immediately following each incident on Gideon's property and 2 other properties in the Northeastern Territory, and a name, not Pierce as the ultimate source. Pierce was the instrument. The name Selden gave was Vivian Crow. Alderman had written, "This is not yet the evidence required for criminal prosecution of Mrs. Crow directly, as Selden's testimony requires corroboration. However, it is sufficient to compel a formal deposition of Denholm Pierce under territorial legal statutes, which I have filed for this Thursday. I expect this development to move quickly from this point. Please remain available for contact." Elena set the letter down. Gideon was looking at the wall above the window, which was how he looked when something large was sitting in him and he was deciding how to carry it. 4 years, he said. At least, she said, probably longer. She's been building this since before I knew there was anything to build against. Yes. Elena folded her hands on the table. People like her count on that. Count on the fact that by the time you understand what's happening, you're already too worn down or too isolated to do anything about it. He looked at her. You weren't worn down. I was angry, she said. That's different. Anger has more fuel than patience. She paused. Though it needs patience to be useful. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the juniper on the slope behind the cabin, the dry winter sound of branches without leaves. Thomas knew what he was sending you into, Gideon said. He didn't say it like an accusation, more like something he'd been turning over for a while and had finally decided to say. She looked at him. What do you mean? He knew about Crow. He knew about the pressure on this property. I'd written to him, not asking for help, just keeping contact. He knew what I was managing. Gideon paused. And then he sent you here. Elena was quiet for a moment. She hadn't known that. Or rather, she hadn't known the specifics, but she'd suspected, in the way that you suspect things about a man who always seemed to know more than he said, who made decisions in advance of needing them and called it planning, who had told her, some debts you can only pay one way. He sent me because he knew you needed someone like me, she said carefully. Yes. Or, she said quieter, he sent me because he knew I needed somewhere like this. She looked at the table. I didn't have anywhere to go, Gideon. The debt, the house, Harlan Grist, all of that was real. But my father also knew that I'd been small for a long time, doing work that mattered for someone else's name. He knew what that does to a person over years. She exhaled slowly. Maybe he sent me here for both reasons. Because the debt was real and because he thought this was a place where I could be larger than I'd been allowed to be. Gideon was very still. I think your father, he said after a moment, understood people better than either of us gave him credit for. She looked up at him. He was watching her with an expression she'd seen in fragments over the past months, in the way he'd handed her a cup without asking, in the way he'd stood on the outcrop above the canyon waiting for her to finish her thought, in the way he'd said, "Come back in one piece," with his voice carefully controlled. She'd seen the fragments individually, and she'd been careful not to assemble them, because assembling them required admitting something that had been quietly true for longer than was entirely comfortable. Elena, he said. She waited. He was not, she had learned, a man who said things he didn't mean. He was also not a man who found the saying easy. He looked at her with the focused, slightly difficult expression of someone crossing territory that didn't have a clear trail. I don't know how to do this well, he said. I want to be honest about that. Do what? He was quiet for a second. This. He gestured slightly between them. I've been alone long enough that I'm not sure I know how to be otherwise. I'm not easy to live with, I know that. You're not that difficult, she said. You're being generous. I'm being accurate. She looked at him steadily. You're contained. That's not the same as difficult. And you're reliable, in a way that I didn't know to look for before and now can't imagine being without. She stopped, because that had come out more plainly than she'd intended, and she felt the slight heat of it. He said, I love you. It landed simply, the way he said most things, without decoration, without the build-up that was supposed to precede it in stories. Just the words, in his voice, with the weight of a man who had been carrying them for long enough that putting them down was both a relief and a risk. She looked at him. She thought about 12 miles of canyon trail with a dead man's letter. She thought about a room with a good latch on the door and 2 wool blankets and a photograph on a shelf. She thought about ledger books and water channels and a burned barn wall and a glass fragment in her coat pocket and a man who had handed her a cup of coffee before she asked and stood on a windy outcrop waiting for her to say what she saw. I know, she said. I've known for a while. She paused. I love you too. I think I started somewhere around the time you handed me the timber contract and told me to fix it, and then didn't second-guess anything I did. Something moved in his face. Not a smile exactly, though it was close, the particular quiet movement of a man whose face wasn't practiced at it, but was trying. That was November, he said. Yes, she said. It was. They sat there for a moment with the letter on the table between them and the fire working steadily in the wood stove and the winter light coming through the east window, and it was not a perfect moment in the way that stories make moments perfect. It was cold in the cabin because the chinking on the north wall still needed proper attention. There was a list of repairs on the table beside the letter. The winter stores were tight, and the next 2 months would require careful management. Nothing had been resolved yet, not fully. Alderman was still working, Hicks was still building his case, Pierce hadn't been deposed, and Vivian Crow was still, for the moment, in the territory. None of that had gone away. But something had settled between them that had been unsettled for months, and that mattered in its own right, separate from everything else. Pierce broke in the second week of February, not dramatically, not the way it happens when someone has a conscience to appeal to. He broke the way a legal instrument breaks when the structural load exceeds its design, practically, and because the alternative was worse. Alderman had been building pressure from 3 directions simultaneously: the deposition, the administrative review that Hicks had escalated to a formal territorial audit, and a letter sent to the Wyoming Bar Association regarding the Laramie County case that had begun attracting attention from that direction as well. Pierce gave a deposition that was 7 hours long. Alderman summarized it for them in 2 pages. The summary established a direct documented relationship between Pierce and Vivian Crow going back 6 years, not just in the current campaign against the northeastern properties, but in 2 prior operations in other parts of the territory, both of which had succeeded because there had been no consolidated opposition. The shell entities, the manufactured precedents, the coordinated harassment, all of it had been done before, refined each time, applied with increasing sophistication. Until now, Vivian Crow's lawyers attempted 3 separate procedural challenges to the investigation over the following 3 weeks. Hicks dismissed all 3. In early March, with the territorial prosecutor preparing formal charges, Vivian Crow liquidated what she could liquidate quickly: one of her outlying properties, a timber contract, a cattle purchasing agreement, and left the territory. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final statement. She was simply there and then she was not, which was, Elena reflected, appropriate for a woman who had always operated on the principle that the less visible she was, the more damage she could do. The Harlan Valley Water Trust was formally dissolved by court order on the 12th of March. Nora Beach's water rights were reinstated with a finding that the challenges had been fraudulently filed. Cal Prater received a determination that the brand dispute records would be formally expunged. 2 other ranches on the Northeast Ridge, the ones that had sold in the past 3 years to buyers Elena had never been able to fully identify, turned out to have sold to Pierce-connected entities, and those transfers were under review. None of this fixed everything. Nora still had the months of losses she'd never recover. Cal still had $200 he'd never see again. The 2 sold properties were complicated by buyers who'd paid in good faith and now faced their own legal uncertainty. The territory's machinery moved the way it always moved, partially, imperfectly, with the grinding pace of institutions that had been built for the general case and struggled with the specific injustice. But Gideon's land was clear. His water rights were documented and unchallenged. The fence line on the southeast boundary held, and no one came to cut it. But spring arrived in the way Wyoming spring arrives. Not gently, not as a gift, but as a hard-won shift in the balance of forces. Winter retreating not because it wanted to, but because the light finally had enough leverage to push it back. The snow went in stages, the mud arrived with enthusiasm, and somewhere under all of it, the ground began the slow work of becoming useful again. Elena was repairing the north wall chinking on a Thursday morning in April, finally off the deferred list, finally being addressed properly with the right material, when Gideon came around from the back pasture and stopped to watch her for a moment. She was on a short ladder, working methodically, and she had lime on her left forearm and a look of concentration that meant she was either thinking about the wall or thinking about something else entirely and using the wall as cover. "You're going to redo that section," he said. She looked at the section. "I know," she said. "I didn't press it in far enough. The mix is too dry." "I know that too." She came down off the ladder. "I was thinking about something else." He handed her the water bucket. "Nora sent word this morning," he said. "Her spring cattle are up 17% over last year. She wanted to let us know." Elena looked at him. Something moved in her chest. Not surprise, but the particular feeling that happened when a thing you'd worked toward produced an actual result in the actual world, when it stopped being an effort and became a fact. "Good," she said. It wasn't enough, but it was what she had. She also said Martha Prater wants to organize a dinner, all of us. She said, and I'm relaying this directly, that it's past time this group ate a proper meal together without legal documents on the table. Elena smiled. It was a real one, unguarded in the way she'd gotten more comfortable with over the months. "Martha's right." "Martha usually is," Gideon said. They stood in the April morning with the canyon wall behind them catching the new light, and the smell of the earth coming back to life under the warming air, and the north wall half repaired between them. The ranch was not transformed. It was not what stories promised a place could become after enough difficulty. It was still a working property with working problems, still a place that demanded more from its people than it gave back in any easily measured way. The cattle needed tending, the water channel needed its seasonal maintenance. The timber contract, renegotiated at terms that were finally fair, meant delivery pressure in the coming months. None of that was finished. It was just different now, and the difference was real. Gideon looked at the wall she'd been working on. "The bottom section is good," he said. "Your application down there is solid." "Thank you," she said. I was starting to wonder. "The top section. I know about the top section." "Just saying." She picked up the trowel and looked at him sideways, and he had that expression again, the one that lived close to a smile without fully committing, the one she'd learned to watch for because it was how she knew when he was at ease. It still happened less often than it should have, because that was who he was, and probably who he'd always be. A man for whom ease was something earned rather than assumed, who carried his history in the particular tension of his shoulders and released it only in increments. She'd learned not to push on it. She'd learned a lot about what not to push on. She'd also learned, in the months since she'd walked 12 miles of canyon trail with a dead man's letter, that most of the things worth knowing about a person don't announce themselves. They're in the small, observable facts. The coffee cup set out before anyone asked for it. The horse offered rather than having to be requested. The way a man stands on a windy ridge and waits without impatience while you think. Her father had known that. He'd known it about Gideon Vale, and he'd known it about his daughter. And whatever he'd weighed in the last weeks of his life, he'd weighed it right. That was the part that still came to her sometimes, quietly, without warning. Not grief, not exactly, but the particular tenderness of understanding a person better after they're gone than you ever managed while they were present. She thought he'd been at peace with that possibility. She thought he'd known she'd figure it out eventually. She hoped he'd been right about more things than just that. "Get me a better mix," she said. "Wetter, then I'll redo the top section." Gideon picked up the mixing bucket without comment and went to work beside her, which was how most of their work happened now, without negotiating it, without the careful navigation of two strangers calibrating their proximity. Just side by side, doing what needed doing, with the canyon light moving across the wall in front of them, and the April air carrying the particular smell of a season that had fought its way back from the edge of something. The ranch was not a symbol. It was not a metaphor for anything. It was a piece of land that two water sources ran through, that winter tried to kill every year, that demanded daily maintenance and offered no guarantees. The people who lived on it were not extraordinary. They were two flawed, sometimes difficult people who had come together out of necessity and stayed together out of something that had grown too large and too specific to be called anything other than what it was. That was not a small thing. In a territory full of people who had lost what they'd built, who had been worn down by sustained pressure from those with more money and more patience and more ruthlessness, who had discovered that the law moved slowly and sometimes in the wrong direction and required a particular kind of stubbornness to make it move at all. In that territory, two people standing at a canyon wall fixing what was broken and not leaving was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the only thing that had ever mattered out here. Not the land itself, not the water rights, or the timber contracts, or the legal filings. Those were the instruments. The actual thing was simpler and older and considerably harder to destroy than any document. The decision to stay. The decision to stand beside someone when the staying got difficult. The decision to know what you were looking at when you finally saw it clearly and not flinch from it. Thomas Whitlock had made that decision for Gideon once, years ago, in a situation Elena still didn't know the full details of, and had stopped needing to know. Gideon had made it for Elena on a cold November afternoon, with a letter on the table and 12 miles of canyon dust still on her boots. Elena had made it, in her own way, the morning she sat down with the ledger books and said, "Tell me what you see, and I will tell you what I can fix." And then, between all the fixing and fighting and the slow accumulation of shared mornings, they had made it for each other, not once, but every day, in the ordinary way that real decisions get made. Without ceremony, without a clean moment to point to. Just the continuous, unglamorous, necessary act of choosing the same thing together until it stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like the shape of a life. The north wall held. Eventually, the whole thing held.